during 1943 and early 1944, opposition to Hitler among the army circles increased in Germany. Germany's military situation in World War II was deteriorating, and plans for a coup, including the assassination of Hitler, were put in place. Hitler too became increasingly suspicious and limited his accessibility to military officers. And very often, he abruptly changed his schedule, which helped in thwarting a lot of attempts on his life. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at several covert operations through the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries. In 1944, there were 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany, and the Germans were worried that these workers could rise in revolt, leading to a civil disturbance. So a plan was put in place, codenamed Valkyrie, which was aimed at suppressing the uprising in case it occurred, using the Territorial Reserve Army troops. Now, the key conspirators in the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler were a mix of civilians and active military officers. This plot to assassinate Hitler came to be known as the July 20 plot because of the date on which it was executed. So the civilian conspirators were mainly individuals who had resigned from the Nazi regime in the 1930s in opposition to the Nazi policies. The military conspirators were General Frederick Olbrich, Major General Henning von Treschkow, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Coincidentally, they were the commanders in charge of the Territorial Reserve Army assigned to Operation Valkyrie. So the plot to assassinate Hitler was born less out of a concern of ideology and more out of a pragmatic objective to rescue Germany. Germany was staring at a catastrophic defeat due to Hitler's mismanagement of the war, and it was important that he was removed from the picture. The plan entailed Colonel Stauffenberg traveling to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolfschanze complex, and placing a briefcase containing 2 bombs under Hitler's briefing table. Once Hitler died in the explosion, the military would claim that the assassination had been part of an attempted coup by the Nazi Party, and this would trigger the implementation of Operation Valkyrie. The Reserve Army would seize key installations in Berlin, arrest high-ranking Nazi officials, and disarm the loyal SS units. The other 2 top Nazi leaders, Göring and Himmler, would be arrested, and that would lay the foundation for the establishment of a new government in Germany. Ludwig Beck, an ex-general who had resigned in opposition to Hitler's aggressive war plans in 1938, would become head of state. And longtime resistor, Karl Friedrich Gödler, would become the new Chancellor of Germany. July 20, 1944 was identified as the day for the execution of the plot, but it turned out to be an unbearably hot day. So Hitler's aides decided to move the meeting from the underground bunker to a wooden bunker above the ground because it had better air circulation. Now this room had numerous windows and a wooden table and other decorative pieces of furniture, which meant that the potential explosion would be significantly reduced because the energy of the blast would be absorbed and dissipated. Stauffenberg realized this, but he still pushed forward with the plan because he believed that 2 bombs would still be adequate to level the room and kill everyone inside it. When he arrived, Stauffenberg excused himself to a private chamber on the pretext of needing to change his shirt. He needed time to prime and arm the two explosive devices, hence this excuse. However, while he and his aide were setting up the devices, there was an unexpected phone call due to which Stauffenberg had to hurry, and he ended up arming only one device. All of a sudden, the impact of the bomb was reduced by half. Stauffenberg understood this, and he felt that if he placed his briefcase as close to Hitler as possible, then the job would still get done. When he entered the meeting room, Stauffenberg pushed his way pretty close to Hitler on the pretext that he was having a difficult time hearing, so he needed to be closer to the Führer. Stauffenberg was able to place the briefcase as close to Hitler as he could, and under the pretext of a personal phone call, exited the room. At precisely 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated and panic ensued in the complex. One person was killed and 20 injured, and Stauffenberg saw the body of one person being carried in a stretcher, covered in Hitler's coat. So he believed that the mission had been accomplished, and he and his aide jumped into a staff car and bluffed their way out of the Wolfschanze complex. Now, Klaus Stauffenberg was the biggest bottleneck in this entire plot. Why? Because he was the executor of the plot and also the director of Operation Valkyrie. Now, while he was flying back to Berlin, he assumed that Operation Valkyrie would have already taken effect. But though the news had spread about an explosion in Hitler's headquarters at Wolfschanze, there was also a rumor floating that Hitler had survived the explosion. So, trying to wait for confirmation from Stauffenberg himself, execution of Operation Valkyrie was put on hold till Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin. And when he finally arrived in Berlin, Stauffenberg was shocked to see that precious hours had been lost with respect to starting the execution of Operation Valkyrie. Confusion ensued, with General Frederick Fromm, the head of the army command, trying to wash his hands of the conspiracy and ordering the arrest of Stauffenberg and the other conspirators. Stauffenberg instead had Friedrich Fromm arrested and started the process for activation of Operation Valkyrie. While the various army units were moving into position, Radio Berlin made the announcement that there had been an explosion in Hitler's headquarters, but the Führer was very much alive. Wait, so how did Hitler really survive this attempt? Well, we knew that the move from the concrete bunker to the wooden office was reducing the impact of the blast by half. And then, instead of two bombs, only one could be activated, which reduced the chances of the impact even further. But the final move, which saved Hitler's life, was when Stauffenberg left the wooden office. The new officer who took his place moved the briefcase behind a wooden post under the table, which ended up shielding Hitler from the blast. Hitler, though, suffered a minor injury in his right arm. Stauffenberg's strange absence from the Wolfschanze headquarters triggered the suspicion that he was part of the conspiracy. The dots were slowly connected, and by the end of the night, General Friedrich Fromm, who had now been released, convened an impromptu court-martial and sentenced all of the conspirators to death. He specifically wanted to make sure that they were immediately put to death, so his own role in the conspiracy would remain unknown. Ludwig Beck committed suicide, while Stauffenberg, von Haften, and Ulbricht were executed by a makeshift firing squad. The story of the July 20 plot and Operation Valkyrie is captured in the Hollywood movie Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise as Klaus Stauffenberg. When the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, was created in 1947, its charter mandated that the CIA focus its counterintelligence on overseas targets only. The American citizens were entitled to a high degree of personal privacy. In 1967, as the domestic protest movements against the Vietnam War increased, President Lyndon B. Johnson was concerned that there was a possible foreign influence on these growing domestic protests. So he authorized Operation Chaos to have the CIA, under Director Richard Helms, spy on the private citizens to look for any evidence of foreign involvement in these protest movements. LBJ suspected that the Soviet Union and China were fueling the fires of this domestic unrest within the United States. So 46 years prior to the Edward Snowden scandal, which blew the cover on Operation PRISM, which was the governmental program for the surveillance of private citizens, Operation Chaos was launched with the same intent. And it continued all the way up till 1974 under President Richard Nixon, because Nixon had the same problem, protests against Vietnam, and he too wanted to get to the bottom of any foreign influence in these protests. So how was the surveillance carried out? It was mainly focused on college campuses, specifically at student protesters. Starting with the basic wiretap, where your home phone's microphone would be effectively turned into a room bug, to a more primitive method of hiring fellow students to spy on their classmates. The interesting part was that these students got the job of spying on their fellow students after a series of interview rounds with the CIA through the college placement services. So these students thought that they were applying for jobs via the on-campus placement services, only to be given this assignment after signing several non-disclosure agreements with the CIA. However, one of the biggest invasions of privacy happened via the mail interception program. This entailed agents using secret locations where mail was sent to be opened and analyzed. The mail would get photographed, and an archive of the correspondence of the targeted individual was gradually built by the CIA. The CIA agents collected the names of American citizens and organizations connected to dissident movements, creating a computerized index of more than 300,000 names. Out of these, approximately 7,200 American citizens had more than 200 files opened on them. These files had the basic information on these individuals, like their places of birth, family member names, and their organizational affiliations. And these was further supplemented with photographs from the mail intercept program. So did the CIA find any evidence of foreign involvement? In 1969, the CIA reported to the White House that there was very little evidence of communist funding and training of such movements, and no evidence of communist direction and control. The report concluded that student radicalism sprang more from political and social alienation at home than anything else. Now, a point to note here is that at the time of submission of this report, Richard Nixon was in the White House. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger did not agree with the findings, and Richard Helms, the CIA director, emphasized that spying on US students was outside the CIA's purview. But the new administration did not agree and asked the CIA to go back to the drawing board and expand its scope. So what brought the program to an end? Actually, it was Watergate. In 1972, there was a discovery that two former CIA operatives were involved with the Watergate burglary, and that brought increased scrutiny on the CIA and the White House. Nixon fired CIA Director Richard Helms and his replacement lasted only a few months before being replaced by William Colby. And in 1974, as the agency faced heightened scrutiny, William Colby terminated Operation Chaos. Subsequently, in December of 1974, 4 months after President Nixon's resignation, the New York Times broke the story of Operation Chaos to the general public. But the biggest impact was on the student activists. They ended up on watch lists, and that had a severe and adverse impact on their academic and professional lives. During the American Civil War in 1862, Major General Ormsby Mitchell, who was commanding the Union troops in Middle Tennessee, devised a plan to capture Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga was a water and railway junction and of strategic importance to the Confederacy. Major General Mitchell felt that capturing Chattanooga would deprive the Western Confederacy of access to the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys. But there was a problem. Even if he captured Chattanooga, the general knew that the Southern Army had the ability to reinforce Chattanooga easily by moving troops from Atlanta via the Southern Railroad system. A civilian by the name of James Andrews came up with an idea that would enable Mitchell to neutralize the ability of the Confederates to move reinforcements into Chattanooga. And how would he accomplish that? Using a small group of volunteers, Andrews proposed a raid that would destroy the Western and Atlantic Railroad, cutting off the channel for reinforcements from Atlanta to Chattanooga. The execution plan was approved by General Mitchell, and the participants were destined to become known as Andrews Raiders, and the raid would become known as the Great Locomotive Chase. So while General Mitchell moved his troops to Chattanooga, Andrews and his men would steal a train on its run towards the city, stop periodically to destroy tracks, bridges, switches, and telegraph lines, and having accomplished that, cross through and rejoin the Union Army. So Andrews, along with his accomplice William Hunter Campbell and 22 volunteer Union soldiers, made their way to their rendezvous point in Marietta, Georgia. They traveled in groups of twos and threes, dressed as civilians to avoid rousing any suspicion. On April 12, 1862, at the Big Shanty, Georgia train station, William Fuller, the conductor of the train known as the General, brought his train to the scheduled stop and took off to have a quick breakfast. And he suddenly heard the sound of his engine puffing away. Andrews and his raiders had swung into action, decoupled the General from its passenger cars, and were commandeering it northward towards Chattanooga. Shocked and out of any options, the train's conductor, William Fuller, started giving chase on foot on the rail tracks. And as originally planned, the raiders stopped periodically to tear up the track, switches, and bridges to cause as much damage as possible, including cutting the telegraph wires. Along the way, the General was shunted into a siding to allow other scheduled southbound trains to pass. But Andrews was able to convince the station master that he was carrying badly needed ammunition to troops at Chattanooga under direct orders from General Beauregard. The station master fell for it and cleared the way for them. By now, though, the conductor William Fuller had gotten hold of a handcar and was still in pursuit. The General was delayed a second time at the junction at Kingston, and Andrews once again tried to use his ammunition story, but he was thwarted because There were two trains approaching, so the general would have to wait till both trains had passed. And this led to a 1 hour delay, which enabled the pursuers to catch up quite a bit with the general. By now, Fuller was running just a few minutes behind. And once he arrived at Kingston, Fuller abandoned his handcar and took over a locomotive to continue with the chase. But Fuller, who had by now other folk helping him out in the chase, had to switch back to running because of the destroyed train tracks. But once they had reached the good tracks, Fuller commandeered another locomotive, the southbound Texas, to speed up his chase. And he was able to save precious time by resuming the pursuit, running the Texas in reverse instead of turning it around. So by now, the Texas was running so close that Andrews and his men had no time to stop and tear up the tracks and cut telegraph lines. Finally, just 18 miles from Chattanooga, the raiders had to abandon the general and scatter themselves for safety. But all the raiders were captured within 2 weeks, and General Mitchell's effort to capture Chattanooga ultimately failed. The raiders were tried in military courts and found guilty of acts of unlawful belligerency. Andrews was hanged, as were 7 others. The remainder, worried that they would face the same fate, made a daring escape. 8 of them succeeded, but 6 others did not. The 6 were held as prisoners of war and were eventually released in a prisoner exchange. On March 25, 1863, the 6 raiders who had been recaptured and released in the prisoner exchange were awarded a newly approved medal, the Medal of Honor. And Jacob Wilson Parrott became the first recipient of that medal. However, in my opinion, the real hero of this story was the conductor of the general, William Allen Fuller. His persistence and grit in chasing the raiders and ultimately thwarting their design was truly brave and very remarkable. But he was on the wrong side during the Civil War, so he did not receive any civilian awards. However, in 1950, the state of Georgia commissioned a special gold medal in honor of Fuller's work during the Great Locomotive Chase. It was presented to his son, William Alfred Fuller, on May the 15th. The hijacked locomotive, General, is on display at the Southern Museum in Kennesaw, Georgia, and the Texas, the locomotive used to give the chase, is on display at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which movie has won the most Oscars? Since its inception, 11 Oscars is the max any movie has won, and 3 movies actually are the joint first with 11 Oscars each. Ben-Hur in 1959, Titanic in 1997, and The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King in 2003. So the answer is A, B, and C. Incidentally, the option D, West Side Story from 1961, is at number 2 with 10 Oscars. Question for the current episode. The story of the Great Locomotive Chase was captured in the 1956 Hollywood movie, The Great Locomotive Chase. Which production house produced this movie? Was it A, Walt Disney, B, Paramount, C, Warner Brothers, or D, MGM? Once again, the story of the Great Locomotive Chase was captured in the 1956 Hollywood movie, The Great Locomotive Chase. Which production house produced this movie? Was it A. Walt Disney, B. Paramount, C. Warner Brothers, or D. MGM? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we look at one of the longest wars fought by the United States and its allies, the Vietnam War. We look at the trigger points, the origins, and what kept it going. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.